What I want to attempt to do this morning is to give you some indication of how the census returns for Dublin in 1911 can be used as a tool for social historians to try and recreate Dublin as it was lived in 1911. The Dublin census returns for 1911 were digitised by the National Archives of Ireland last year, a project that enthralled both professional and amateur researchers because it afforded that golden opportunity to try and seek not just ancestors, but also seek answers as to how the city evolved, as to how the city's inhabitants lived and died, and how they went about their ordinary lives. And I want to just give you a brief overview of what some of those ordinary lives would have involved. When this project was launched, I was reminded of a book that I had first come across in the late 1980s when I began studying history in Dublin. It was called The Gorgeous Mask. And it was a book published by the Trinity College Dublin History Workshop. And it was a collection of essays on Dublin in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And the title of the book, The Gorgeous Mask, was borrowed from one of Dublin's most famous residents in the 18th century, Jonathan Swift, who was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, man of letters, polemicist, politician, and somebody who had a deep and abiding concern for the poor of Dublin City. And he made a reference to Dublin City being the gorgeous mask of Ireland's distress in the 1720s when he was writing about it. And he wrote a lot more about poverty in Dublin between 1725 and 1735. And he asked one overriding question: what shall we do with the foreign poor? And this was a reference not just to those from outside of Ireland, but particularly those from rural parts of Ireland, who during the bad winters in particular would have travelled to Dublin in order to seek work, in order to seek food. We heard a lot yesterday about those incredibly important voyages that many people made during the famine years from Ireland to Canada and other places. But there was that internal journey within Ireland to the country's capital city for those who were seeking some kind of solace and seeking work and food. And Jonathan Swift asked that question about what could be done with them, particularly in the context of them being a drain on the resources of Dublin and, of course, creating all sorts of concern, particularly with regard to public order. Jonathan Swift also referred to the extravagant drunkenness of the sturdy poor of Dublin, a reference to the public manifestations of the side of Dublin, or the part of Dublin that many in Swift's position did not necessarily want to see. And Swift, along with other writers in Ireland in the 18th century, did comment on this city of contradictions, that you had extraordinary wealth, that you had a city that at that stage was regarded as the second city of the British Empire, that you had splendour, that you had beautiful buildings that had been built or remodelled according to the latest canons of architectural taste, but that you also had this huge squalor, that you also had this distress behind the gorgeous mask, behind the facade. And in a sense, Dublin in 1911 was still the gorgeous mask of Ireland's distress, and you can actually trace much of that distress through the 1911 census returns for Dublin. You can also, of course, trace the splendour and the wealth that did exist there as well. It was still a significant city. It was a small city. It was an elegant city. It was a city that had a population of 477,196 people. There were many fine public and civic buildings, which of course were a reminder of its status as the second city of the British Empire. But at this stage in 1911, many of those buildings were just a reminder of a different era. They were the architectural legacy of a different era. Dublin in 1911 was not so much the second city of the British Empire as the first city of nationalist Ireland. So if we want to have a look at the political importance of Dublin in 1911, we do need to be conscious of the extent to which it was beginning to challenge British rule in Ireland. Now, in the heart of Dublin City, you still had Dublin Castle and all that it represented. That was the home of British rule in Ireland. And if you look at the symbols and the substance of British rule in Ireland in 1911, you do need to be conscious of Dublin Castle, but you also need to be conscious of the pride and the sympathy that existed for the British Empire still at this stage in 1911, despite the fact that there was something of a nationalist resurgence. Sean O'Faolain, for example, one of Ireland's greatest writers, referred to the tremendous pride that he had growing up in being part of the British Empire. He said, "I gloried in all its trappings," and he referred to the kings and the queens and the dukes and the duchesses, and the soldiers in particular, who were such a prominent part of Dublin life at the turn of the 20th century. It was a city that was still distinguished by its Georgian heritage, by its Georgian architecture as well. There was a certain elegance there that is associated with that. If you consider places in Dublin City like Merrion Square, for example, Fitzwilliam Square, if you consider the gracious parks that we associate with the city and the outskirts of the city, you can see that sense of a city that does have a quite glorious past in terms of the actual symbols of British rule in Ireland and the actual manifestations of that rule and the manifestations of that degree of comfort and splendour as well. And there were those in Dublin in 1911 who were lucky enough to be comfortable. If you take a novel like Strumpet City by James Plunkett, a novel which is set in the Dublin of this era, you can see a reference to a character called Belton Yearling, who used to take the tram or the train from Kingstown, which was on the outskirts of Dublin, it's now known as Dunleera, into Dublin City. And he talked about all the joyous things that he saw on his way in from Kingston into Dublin City. He likes the yachts with their coloured sails. He likes the blue shape of Howth Hill. This idea of the August bathers at ease with themselves. This idea of a city that was very lucky to be so close to the sea. And he also talked about the environment in Dublin. The idea of the soft, salt-like air, and in particular, the easy conversation of its inhabitants. Belton Yearling clearly loved his city, was the conclusion of James Plunkett when he wrote that novel, Strumpet City. There were other writers who came to similar conclusions about the appeal of Dublin. If you take William Dawson, for example, who wrote a book in 1912, My Year in Dublin, he refers to Dublin as having a reputation for being happy-go-lucky. And he said, don't be ashamed of it, glory in it. It is a singular achievement to be happy anywhere in the 20th century. So we do get this sense of a Dublin at ease with itself, of a city of talkers. There was a Dublin as well that was wealthy and indulged, despite the erosion of the power of the Protestant ascendancy that began in particular in the 19th century. The Catholic professional and business class had taken over much of the city's governance, but there were those like Belton Yearling, who did live in the suburbs, and those who moved out to the townships. There were 10 independent townships in Dublin in 1911. They were independent of city government. And they were often the places where those who felt the sands of change, shifting, moved, particularly members of the Protestant ascendancy. If you take the religious composition of Dublin in 1911, you will see that 83% of the population was Catholic. 13% of the population was Church of Ireland or Protestant. Many of them, of course, made their way out to these new townships. In many respects, they were the unionist strongholds within the city of Dublin, or on the outskirts of the city of Dublin at that stage. The move out there was facilitated by the arrival of trams, by the arrival of electric trams in particular. And you can get a sense of a city divided by wealth, by class, and by religion when you look at the divides between city and the townships as well. You also get a sense that the opportunities for mutual contact were being lessened in early 20th century Dublin as a result of these divides. In some respects, the loss of those people was a loss not just to city living, but also to municipal life as well, given the considerable experience they had. They did have their own havens within the city. The Kildare Street Club, for example, the Gentleman's Club. There were 6 visitors staying there on census night on the 2nd of April 1911. They were attended to by 32 staff. There's also a reminder, I suppose, of the impact that the move outwards had in terms of the actual creation of Dublin as a 20th century city. We often consider Dublin an 18th century city. It's often referred to as an 18th century city. When you look at the census returns of 1911, though, you can see that the city was created in the 20th century, particularly when you look at the housing stock. By 2002, less than 15% of housing in Dublin predated 1919. So we do have to be mindful of the degree to which this was a city that was created in the early 20th century as opposed to a city that was created in the 18th century. And you can trace that right through the housing stock up to the early 21st century. You do get this idea as well of a city that is deliberately planned in that way, the move out to the suburbs. The idea of low density. the idea of a city that is not high-rise. Those formative decisions were made around this period in the early 20th century that give the city of Dublin its distinctive character today. And we need to be mindful of how it differed from other European cities, but also what it had in common with other European cities, particularly this idea of a move away from the centre of the city.